Well, welcome back to Comic Book Historians. I'm Alex Grant. Go ahead and click on that juicy red subscribe button down below. Now, I've been asked to create a Stan Lee co-creator video because obviously I've spent a lot of time doing that for Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby. Now, Stan Lee is beloved by many fans, but unfortunately, in a lot of occasions, he's thought of as the sole creator of the Marvel Universe, that he created all those characters and stories by himself. And that's just not true. Clearly, from my past Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko co-creator videos, they brought plots and stories and ideas with them, along with the art that they were drawing. Unfortunately, in working with Stan Lee, they got no writer credit. Stan got all that writer credit, and they were labeled as the artist of the story. Now, to get a sense of why this confusion occurred, let's examine Julius Schwartz.
I started the Silver Age.
Now, he labeled himself an editor, and he would co-plot stories with a writer and an artist.
Two bobs.
The writer and artist would generate a script and then artwork, and a lot of times Julius Schwartz's editor would sometimes change the dialogue until it was not even recognizable to the original script, but he still just called himself an editor, even though a lot of those initial ideas were actually his, and utilizing a lot of science fiction principles that he brought with him as a former science fiction agent. Now, Stan Lee was the quote-unquote writer, but he was actually co-plotting and having plotting sessions with people like Steve Ditko or Jack Kirby.
We don't do the stories the way most other outfits do. We kick around a plot very, very loosely and generally for a story, just discuss it for a few minutes. Jack came up with an idea, a fellow named Ego, who's a living planet.
Bioverse, the living planet to a multiple virus.
What was he, a biverse, instead of a universe?
Bioverse.
Which I'm sure we're all very familiar with.
He can contend with Thor on Thor's level. Could be accepted, maybe not on a friendly basis, but certainly on a realistic basis.
And off he goes. I don't know where he goes, but off he goes. I don't see him for a week. He comes back a week later and the whole strip is drawn. And nobody knows what I'm going to see on those pages. He may have come up with a dozen new ideas, you see. Then I take it and I write it on the basis of what Jack has drawn. He's broken it down to continuity for me. In fact, he's drawn the whole thing, actually. I put in the dialogue and the captions.
Even though the artist actually told the story before even giving it to him to write the words in. It brought a lot of great stories for us consumers, but it left a lot of these artists frustrated that they were kind of pigeonholed into this role, but doing a lot of the work, especially a lot of the creativity. For example, I'm fairly certain, especially if you listen to this soundbite, that it was Jack Kirby that came up with Thor.
Well, I think you also pioneered the use of mythological superheroes. I'm talking about Thor, which you two come up with every month.
Well, you've got the right guy here, because I would say that Jack is the greatest mythological creator in the world. And I think that Jack has turned him into one of the greatest fictional characters there are.
Did you do a lot of homework on that, a lot of Norse myths and so forth?
All through the years, certainly, I've had a kind of affection for any mythological type of character and my conception of what they should look like, and I wasn't going to draw back from really letting myself go. So I did.
Now later, like in the 1990s and beyond, Stan is asked the same question, and here's what he says now.
We have Spider-Man who climbs walls, blah, blah, blah. Who can we get that's even bigger and better and stronger? And it occurred to me, the only thing we could do, perhaps, is come up with a god. I thought it would be fun to make a god a hero. So I'm not the world's greatest authority on gods, but I brushed up a little on the Roman gods, and I said, we've seen a lot of them. Looked into the Greek gods, well, everybody knows them. And then I stumbled on the Norse gods. And I realized they're not as well known. So I was reading about them, and then I came across the mighty Thor, god of thunder. And I liked the idea that he could create storms, that he was one of the strongest, if not the strongest, of all the Norse gods, and I especially liked the idea that he had a hammer.
It's a little frustrating. Kind of like listening to an uncle that's really cool, kind of lie about something. Now, one of the things I did with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko was I went back and I read everything they did before they worked over at Marvel in the 1960s, and I was able to trace plots and story ideas that they likely brought with them to Stan. Well, it's harder to do that with Stan Lee because Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko have artistic styles. We know that they drew those stories. With Stan, how do you really know? And that's why it's super valuable that Doc Vassallo has done all this research on what were very likely Stan Lee's stories leading up to his time at Marvel Comics. It's all listed on his blog. And so then I obsessively read every single one, and I'm pretty sure I've isolated which elements and plots and ideas that Stan Lee contributed to those discussions with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. Stan didn't just let other people do the work and then he didn't do anything. He obviously did something.
Even you and I aren't perfect.
He directed the entire line at Marvel. He wrote the letters pages. He narrated a bunch of cartoons, got people all into it.
Welcome. This is Stan Lee of Marvel Comics.
Those cameos actually got maybe 12 generations of kids obsessed with Marvel Comics. So he clearly did his job in that regard. But he actually did bring some ideas. And here they are. Now moving through chronological order, Lee's first story was for Captain America Comics 3, 1941, in a 2-page text insert that was there to reduce shipping costs for the post office. This is the first mention of Captain America throwing his circular shield like a disc at a far-away target. Prior to this, Simon and Kirby used the shield in a defensive manner or to enhance a punch. This method of offensive attack was also used by Lee and Kirby in Cap's first Silver Age Marvel appearance in Avengers 4, 1964. Stan Lee's first comic book story credit goes to his creation of Jack Frost, illustrated by the Blue Beetle creator Charles Nicholas. Reading this story has two interesting precursors. One is for the character Iceman, who first appeared in Uncanny X-Men 1, 1963. The second characteristic that seems imported from Jack Frost into the Silver Age is that, like the Incredible Hulk, he is misunderstood by authority figures like the police or the military, causing him to become angry and antagonistic towards society, which would define many Marvel characters later like Spider-Man, who had the same issues with the law. The Black Marvel is one of those forgotten characters of Timely's golden age, but the specific issue written by Stan Lee All Winners Comics 1, 1941, he writes about the Order of the Hood, a secret society or hooded crime syndicate conspiring for wrongdoing, monsters and villains, which is reminiscent of the secret empire created by Lee and Kirby in Tales to Astonish 81, 1966. This hooded terrorist group was a branch of Hydra conspiring to tear down Western civilization. In Young Allies Comics 1, 1941, Lee introduces to the reader that there are unsolved world mysteries, including the giant heads of Mexico, which many infer to be the result of ancient aliens or gods from thousands of years ago. This can be linked to Norse gods and the Easter Island Stoneman monsters that attacked Thor in Journey to Mexico 83, 1962. Stan Lee and Blue Beetle creator Charlie Nicholas created another character for Timely, Headline Hunter, for Captain America Comics 5, 1941. This foreign correspondent often demonstrated a nose for news behind front lines to deliver updates of enemy activities to the West.
Crap.
It's here that Lee is expressing interest in journalists at the newsroom. Lee and Ditko placed Peter Parker, the alter ego of the Amazing Spider-Man, at a newspaper organization called the Daily Bugle, or would turn in photos to his editor and headline hunter, J. Jonah Jameson.
Meat. I'll send you a nice box of Christmas meat. Best I can do. Get out of here.
The Destroyer is another forgotten Timely hero created by Stan Lee and Jack Bender in Mystic Comics 6, 1941. The Destroyer was another journalist named Keen Marlowe, who was captured behind enemy lines in Nazi Germany during World War II. He is trapped with a fellow prisoner, Professor Eric Schmidt, who sacrifices himself to bestow the power upon Marlowe.
Don't waste your life.
To become the super strong Destroyer and break out of prison. This is really the same setup as Tony Stark behind North Vietnamese communist enemy lines during the Vietnam War, trapped with Professor Ho Yinsen. Yinsen also helped Stark develop the Iron Man armor and escape at the cost of his own life. Now another text insert is written by Stan Lee was Marvel Get Together, where various Golden Age heroes interact and team up in Marvel Mystery Comics 25, 1941. This is really speaking to Lee's later job in co-assembling the newly created Silver Age characters into the mighty Avengers 1, 1963. It's really a testament to Stan Lee's curiosity of how different personalities could or couldn't get along through dialogue.
Excuse me, did we come to your planet and blow stuff up?
By the time Mystic Comics 7, 1941 came out in September of that year, Lee was very comfortable working with the dynamic and talented Al Avison, to the extent of crediting this Destroyer story, The Machine of Death, as a combined talent feature thriller. Stan would eventually do something similar with his credits with Jack Kirby in the later issues of the Fantastic Four, like issue 59, 1967, by clumping them together in a circular shape to express that both creators contributed to the book, which seemed to be some method for Lee to rectify the imbalance of credit on previous issues. Now, Rockman Underground Secret Agent was created by Basil Wolverton in USA Comics 1, 1941. However, issue 3 was written by Stan Lee and drawn by Charlie Nicholas, and discussed an underground race of little people, as well as Rockman's mole ship. This concept seemed very much in line with the Mole Man created by Lee and Kirby for Fantastic Four 1, 1961, who lived and traveled under the ground. The little people who live with Rockman are very similar to the later Moloids, also known as the Mole People in Fantastic Four 22, 1964. Now this next one's interesting. The Imp was created by Stan Lee and Chad Grotkopf in Captain America Comics 12, 1942. This was about a small green-clothed creature whose cartoon-like qualities made him both formidable and annoying to his enemies.
This is how we handle things down in Toontown.
Although not a superhero or supervillain by many comic readers' standards, he was an odd Toon-like protagonist. This was a similar or same concept as the Impossible Man from Fantastic Four 11, 1963. This character, also small and green, could manipulate his body in a manner like that of a cartoon, which defied all normal standards of physics and entered the realm of the impossible. One name that Stan Lee seemed to go back to a lot was the name Crusher. He used this name as far back as in Mystic Comics 8, 1942 in The Challenger, written by Stan Lee with art by Mike Sikowski and George Klein. Essentially, this Crusher character was the world's strongest wrestler, whom he brings the same type of guy into the first appearance of Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy 15, 1962. He used the same name for a similar bald and strong figure in Crusher Creel, the Absorbing Man, in Journey to Mystery 114, 1965, who looks the same as the other Crusher in the previously mentioned issue. Stan Lee also wrote Young Allies 10, 1943, The Horror of the Doll Devil, regarding a villain who uses black magic to manipulate people's bodies using voodoo dolls, which seemed to be helpful in a later Silver Age story. That story concerns the radioactive dolls used by the Puppet Master, who caused a similar type of mischief in Fantastic Four 8, 1962. What Lee seemed to excel at, though, was juvenile romance in the teen genre. His tongue-in-cheek dialogue was present as far back as in comics like Millie the Model, Sherry the Showgirl, and Homer Hooper 3, 1953. The similarities of this comic to Archie are pretty obvious.
I'm gonna take a shower first.
This work carries directly into Lee's transformation of Spider-Man to a teen drama with love triangles. After Ditko left the book, Lee enjoyed the times when he made a central figure the target of a couple people's attention. The Last Command of Colonel Fong from Battle 17, 1953 is a perfect example of Lee writing a war book that dealt with the communists in North Korea. The large, bald colonel was ruthless in the way he treated his own men and the enemy. The Korean War gave Lee plenty of practice writing and editing scripts about Americans fighting the imposing communist threat during the so-called atomic or television age of comic books. This experience appears to have made it into the Silver Age of Marvel, when Lee scripted and co-plotted the origin of Iron Man, and early Thor comics like Journey to Mystery 93, 1963, where communist China uses their science to create the radioactive man. Other than commies, Lee often wrote about unrequited love, where a person romantically longed for another character.
I wrote you every day for a year.
But they were tragically alone and unreciprocated in those feelings. This form of romantic tragedy added some spice to a superhero story by throwing in juvenile emotions that connected teenage readers. An early example is found in Actual Confessions 13, 1952, called Love 'Em and Leave 'Em, with script by Stan Lee and art by Werner Roth. The central character stands at a window unfulfilled because his true love does not love him back. In Uncanny X-Men 3, 1963, Lee dialogues both Cyclops and Professor X to have unrequited love for Jean Grey. Professor X's involvement in this love triangle was wisely dropped from the storyline, and thank goodness, because it's pretty gross. Unrequited love was all over Marvel's Silver Age, like Journey to Mystery 89, 1963, showing the blonde Donald Blake, aka the mighty Thor's human alter ego, pining for nurse Jane Foster. But there is a romantic precursor that both examples lead to, with Jean Grey and Jane Foster. And that's in My Own Romance 27, 1953 for Love Story, with script by Stan Lee and art by later DC superhero artists Carmine Infantino and Gil Kane. A blonde man falls in love with a very similar nurse named Jane Grey, who very much looks like and has the same first name and profession as Nurse Jane Foster from the later Thor stories. However, her last name is Grey, the same as Jean Grey from the X-Men. Lee also took time to interact with fans on the letters pages, sometimes putting in fake letters he wrote, but also responding to fans' questions. He undoubtedly brought that fun interaction to his comics and created a sense of camaraderie with readers. Here's a pre-Marvel example from My Own Romance 24, 1952, whose answers show a developing sense of how to engage the reader. By the time Lee gets to the 1960s, though, this level of engagement had hit a professional and intuitive level, where his sense of what would work on the letters pages became very refined. This letters page here is from Amazing Spider-Man 39, 1966, and his sense of timing through dialogue is at its peak. And there just was no other editor at the time that could match this level of interactive banter with his adoring crowd. There just wasn't. The Hooded Horror in Mystic 12, 1952, gathered the local mob bosses and threatened them with certain death unless they work for him and give him a percentage of their profits.
It'll cost you 40% of what you make. And trust me, you're about to make a lot more.
However, this character functions as a precursor to the Marvel Silver Age character Baron Zemo.
He's out of line, but he's right.
Created for Avengers 4, 1964. This red-hooded figure was fighting Captain America during World War II, and his secret adhesive X spilled on him, fusing his mask to his face. Lee's Hooded Horror from 1952 carries the same dark secret and laments over the same problem. Although he was a character feared by his enemies, the Hooded Horror lived with the curse that his mask and face were one and the same. Another famous character created by Stan Lee and Joe Maneely was the Black Knight, created for Black Knight 1, 1955, about Sir Percy of Scandia, servant and warrior for King Arthur and Merlin. His ebony blade was forged by Merlin from a meteorite that landed on Earth.
Like this?
Lee brought back this figure's alter ego through Sir Percy's descendant, Professor Nathan Garrett, who was unworthy to wield the ebony blade and so recreated himself as the Black Knight through advanced technology. Garrett's Black Knight premiered in Tales to Astonish 52, 1964, and was created by Stan Lee and Dick Ayers, likely at Stan Lee's direction. This Black Knight fought Giant Man in his first appearance, and later joined the villainous team of the Masters of Evil. In Adventures into Weird Worlds 14, 1943, written by Stan Lee and art by Infantino and Gil Kane, there was an alien from Saturn who was exiled to Earth because he was the first murderer on his peaceful planet in 3,000 years. This numerically and conceptually lines up with the origin of Ramatut, aka Kang, in Fantastic Four 19, 1964. When the villain brags to the quartet that in the year 3000, he was the only one on Earth not satisfied with peace. This Batseed was so restless and bloodthirsty that he traveled back in time in order to engage in war and murder. Not the same character, but the same number of years and origin concept for both villains. Now, Stan Lee wrote the newspaper strip Willie Lumpkin with future Archie comic artist Dan DeCarlo from 1959 to 1961. The first issue of Fantastic Four 1, 1961 was released a bit after the last Willie Lumpkin strip, and Lee brought his character as a much older man into Fantastic Four 11, 1963.
I've got the usual for you. Thanks, Willie.
Now, Lumpkin was the mailman at the quartet's Baxter building, delivering mail and offering a bit of humanity to the superpowered comic book. Now, whether these concepts or plots are any good or not, that's up to the reader. But one thing's for sure, Stan Lee brought these ideas with him into the creative mix while he was co-writing the material with Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby. And it's also ridiculous to say that he contributed nothing, because he obviously did. But it's also equally ridiculous to say that he created all of it. When he didn't share co-writer credit with the others, that was kind of a creative sin in a way. It may have been standard at Marvel at the time, whatever. It's the 60s and people were jerks, okay? But technically speaking, it screwed the people he was working with. Either way, it becomes fascinating to see all the ingredients brought in by these three men that contributed to a pop culture that still resonates even to this very day.